So sorry to everyone who is trying to watch this recording afterwards. You've missed two of our introductions, Gloria, Sheu, and Julie Percival. They will be talking again later, but I was slow to start the recording, so just starting it now. So I will hand back off to you, Sarah.
Thanks. Welcome to those watching the recording. We're just going through having the panelists describe themselves and the job that they do. So let's go to Jess Grana.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Grana. I'm a group leader and a principal economist at MITRE. So a little bit about MITRE. MITRE operates what are called federally funded research and development centers. You can think of them like a federal research lab. So what FFRDCs do is essentially we partner with different government agencies to help develop various technical and scientific solutions to help them with their mission. So a little bit about where we're located. So I'm in the McLean office in the DC area. This is one of our two headquarters. The other one is up in Bedford, Massachusetts, like in the Boston area. And then we have a variety of satellite offices around the world, really. I mentioned we work with government agencies. So some of the ones we work with include Department of Commerce, Treasury, IRS, the FAA, Department of Homeland Security, CMS. So it runs a pretty wide gamut of different types of problems that we try to help with. And a little bit about our workforce. We have, I think by the last count, around 10,000 people. I like to say we're the largest company a lot of people haven't heard of. It's kind of interesting how much things we're touching and, different policy areas, different technical solutions we're working on. And a lot of people, we sort of fly under the radar. So across the 10,000 workforce, we do employ economists, but also a lot of engineers. So systems engineering is probably one of our core capabilities. We also have data scientists, statisticians, various subject matter experts in technology, IT, business modernization. So pretty broad range of capabilities there. So that's MITRE. And what do I do at MITRE? So in my role, I sort of wear three different hats. As a group leader, I manage a small team of economists and economic analysts. And our group is located in the part of MITRE that supports the Department of Commerce. So for those of you who might not know much about the Department of Commerce, it's a pretty broad mission. They have, at the last count, 10 or 12, I have to double check, bureaus under the Commerce umbrella that focus on different issues broadly related to like US industrial competitiveness. So the types of economics problems we see are related to things like trade, industrial policy, workforce, environmental economics. So NOAA's under that umbrella. So that's sort of where our group is situated. Another hat I wear is as project leader. So as a project leader, I manage teams of people working on a particular task or a particular research project. And these teams at MITRE are typically very interdisciplinary. So I mentioned, we hire out these different skill sets. So everyone brings something different to the table. But economics is just one component of what we do. And on the teams, we have a mix of, senior experts, mid-career folks, and early career analysts. So we like to have that balance of different skill sets. And I guess last thing I'll say is most of the projects we have are on a 1-year timeline, but we do have shorter, 6 months projects depending on what the government needs. And then the last hat I wear is as a technical contributor. So I do economic research. I'm an economist. I'm a practicing economist. I write papers. I work with analysts to execute on the analysis. And one example of a paper that we actually just got accepted, it was for the IRS, and we were helping the IRS estimate the indirect effect of an audit. So this is the idea that when someone is audited, the audit impacts their future tax reporting behavior. And so this is something that the IRS has wanted to understand for a while because it has implications on sort of the overall return on investment of IRS enforcement. So it helps with budget conversations about justifying funding. It also helps the IRS understand, when you look at different indirect effects across different audit programs, that has implications for how you should be allocating resources more efficiently. So the types of questions that we answer require the technical skill sets that you would receive in a PhD program, but they're very much policy relevant. They're very much like, how can the government take this estimate and use it to do what they do better? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So I'll have one quick follow-up. So when is it like with the IRS or Commerce, are they coming to you because like what's the division between their internal expertise and using you? Is it like similar types of activities, or is it like they just don't have the capacity, or it's a different like style of work than if you were to work as an economist, for example, in an agency?
Right. Yeah. So the FFRDC structure is very unique in that. So we were created. The FFRDC is created essentially by Congress to provide an external R&D capability for a particular federal agency. So whenever an agency faces technical issues that sort of outside of their day-to-day scope, they require very specialized skill sets, but also that you can't just kind of like bring in an academic or private partner, like a private industry, like a contractor, because there's like sensitive data issues. There's like business rules. For instance, we have access to like tax returns at an IRS laptop. We have access to like audit selection criteria. So those are things that you kind of need like a special entity for.
Great, thank you. Scott.
Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Wentland, and I'm a senior research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so the BEA is the agency we're known for producing our national economic accounts. Our sort of headline statistic, gross domestic product, is something that I think everyone hears about at least once a quarter, and sort of what it goes into making GDP and our national economic accounts is a lot of economists, and so we employ, I think. We're not very large. We're about, I think, around 500 employees. But of that, we have dozens of PhD economists and many dozens of economists with either master's degrees or undergrad degrees, as well as folks with degrees in finance or accounting. And that sort of all goes into producing the economic statistics, where we have staff that works on sort of what we call our sort of production staff, which focus on the sort of nuts and bolts of actually putting together these statistics that both go into GDP as well as all of the other accounts that we produce. And then we have research staff that I'm a part of. I'm in the Office of the Chief Economist, which is one of our several research groups within the BEA, where research staff are kind of like the R&D of economic statistics. There are those of us in the other statistical agencies like Census and BLS who work on all sorts of topics, both in helping either improve the statistics in some way, work on sort of frontier methodological issues, or in some cases developing new statistics and new accounts, which a number of people in my group have done, and I'm sort of working on currently. But this is when the UN statistical system that produces our international guidelines, a system of national accounts. It's updated every so often, and in those updates, that includes calls for countries to produce new information, new economic information. And oftentimes, those new accounts and new statistics come out of the research staff that are sort of working on sort of the frontiers of those statistics, like developing new accounts for healthcare or education, or in my case, one of the things I do as part of my day job is working on developing environmental economic accounts, which quantify various aspects of our natural capital. And so my research is on valuing land and other environmental assets, as well as just working on economics research that's sort of relevant more generally that you would see in academic journals. So that's something that myself and a number of other economists at the BEA, we publish regularly in our fields of expertise. So my day-to-day is some split among those tasks, whether it's working on the accounts specifically at BEA, or whether it is working on writing papers for journal articles. And so in that sense, I sort of have researchers in the federal government have kind of one foot in sort of the government space and one foot in the academic space. I know this is sort of a non-academic um, uh, uh, discussion today, but I think many of us, kind of have somewhat of, so we're somewhat participants in sort of both. If you participate in research. And so, and I think that's true not just for the PhD economists at BEA as well as other statistical agencies and at the Fed, but even those with an undergrad or master's degree in economics will often be part of teams that are producing economic research that will be published in academic journals and so forth. And so that's a sort of very academic exercise, kind of creeps into a lot of economics positions within the federal government. And the last thing I'll say is just sort of how I got here is I went straight through and got my bachelor's degree and PhD with sort of no break in between. And then I went right into an academic position as an assistant professor of economics. And so I did that for a while, got tenure, and then I moved on to, shortly after that, I moved on to a government position, government research position. And so one way to think of some government research positions, it is a lot like being a professor, but without students, in the sense that we are still doing the research that the professors are doing, and we go to the conferences and talk with professors and so forth. But instead of teaching students on a day-to-day, we're engaging with either some policy work or something related to our or something directly falling out of our agency's mission. So in our BEA, it's economic statistics, and other agencies, it'll be some other policy work or something that economists do. So I think there are, so to sort of wrap up, that even though there are non-academic jobs, so to speak, in title, it does share a lot with the academic folks for a lot of economics positions in the federal government. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Scott got us started a little bit on this, but I'm going to go around again and have everybody talk a little bit about what their own career path was, and whatever they think might be most relevant for this group, and also to the extent that you think it could be helpful, maybe some of the other types of positions in your organization, or other ways that people sort of make their way through a career in your organization or other ones that you've worked in. So let's start again with Gloria.
Yeah, so first, just to talk a little bit about my path here to the Federal Reserve Board. So in graduate school, my fields were international trade and industrial organization. And when I went on the market, my job market paper was pretty much a international trade focused paper. I will say that, like, in the process of interviewing on the market and looking at different jobs, I started being a little bit more interested in a lot of industrial organization more related opportunities, specifically within the federal government. The year that I was on the market was 2009, 2010. So there was the great financial crisis and the Great Recession had just happened. I think a lot of academic positions were not open, and there was very little private sector that year, but there were a number of federal positions that were open, and I interviewed for a bunch in really close succession. And it was the IO and antitrust ones that stood out to me as being really interesting. And those were things that I'd never had any exposure to before. So what ended up happening was I took a job at the DOJ, at the U.S. Department of Justice in their antitrust division. And I started there in the fall of 2010. So this is immediately after graduate school. It was very much not a research position. So this is, I was not expected to do research, and in many cases did not have time to do research. I would say over my time there, I was there for 9 years. Probably more than 80% of my time was on policy work. The remainder for some research that I could squeeze in when there was slow times between my policy work. But at the time that didn't really bother me because I just got exposed to so many interesting things on the policy side. I had not had any background in antitrust before, so I hadn't done like, some folks have maybe been an RA in antitrust consulting before, or did some studies related to that for their PhD. I had not had any of that, so there's a lot of learning on the job, which is actually, I think, expected in most antitrust contexts because it's pretty specialized. Folks don't, there's exceptions, of course, but I think folks aren't expected to have focused on that in graduate school when they start one of these jobs. So I worked mostly on merger investigations. I did work on mergers in telecom, health insurance, airlines, electricity, random industrial products. So like all over the place. Again, did not have any background in any of these industries prior to doing that. But that was normal. That was how we all learned. I was one of the really cool experiences I did was prepare as part of teams that were litigating mergers. So when the DOJ would like to stop a proposed merger, they have to sue in federal court. Staff at the DOJ prepare a case. So it's teams of attorneys and economists doing that. It's very intense because you're on a pretty fast federal court schedule. I was fortunate to have the experience to do that twice on cases that went all the way through appeal, in addition to other cases that went through part of the process, not making it all the way to appeal. And as part of that, it was a pretty intense schedule, but I learned an awful lot about antitrust economics and about working in large teams with a lot of different types of staff. Another interesting opportunity I had while I was at DOJ was I got to do a detail to the Federal Communications Commission, which is another agency that works on mergers and antitrust. I was the chief economist of their wireless bureau when they had like a switchover between two of the permanent people in that position. And so at that point, I got to see another agency that was obviously working specifically on telecom related issues in antitrust, but was still working on like very related things. And so I worked on merger cases there and on the 2014 net neutrality order. So that was some type of stuff that I wouldn't have been able to see at DOJ. So like overall, I had really excellent experience there. Learned a lot really quickly, including a number of things that sparked ideas for research. But as I mentioned, I did not have a ton of time to do research there. So in 2019, when there was an opening that is eventually the position I took at the Federal Reserve Board in their group that also works on mergers, I decided to make the switch. And as I mentioned earlier, and for the benefit of folks who are listening to the recording, I can spend about a third of my time on research at the board, which was just not true when I was at DOJ. But there was a trade-off. I like my job now, and I find that it's a lot more less intense schedule, and I have plenty of time for research. But the flip side is like the types of policy things that I work on. I think in many ways, we don't get the types of more, I'll call them interesting mergers that you get at DOJ because they're mergers that we're reviewing at the Federal Reserve Board are by definition always between banks. So they're kind of direct horizontal competitors. We don't have situations like you see at DOJ where you have like some sort of, mergers between companies that do complements or what kind of like more kind of off the beaten track type issues that come up with that. They work on a lot of non-merger work, like they're highly publicized cases that are in process right now with Google. Like that's not the type of stuff that I'm working on at the board. So it's a trade-off in terms of like the subject matter that I get to see versus work-life balance versus time for research and all of that. So that's kind of my career path. Sarah was also asking about other opportunities in the institution that I work at. So the Federal Reserve Board hires tons of economists. I would say, so we have hundreds of economists on staff. I'm a little different in that I'm working on IO and mergers. There's certainly a number of folks who are doing that, but I would say we're a pretty small number of economists relative to the overall. Much more common specializations would be obviously macro, folks working on monetary policy, financial markets. Those are like the big ones. But as you just said, like I'm working on stuff related to banking regulation. We are a major, or one of the 3 agencies that handle the bank regulation in the United States. So folks who are working on, you might think like more micro issues. There's certainly a number of us too. So yeah, hundreds of PhD economists usually hiring in all of these different spaces in a given season. We also, for folks who are earlier on, we have an RA-ship program that goes for 2 to 3 years, typically between college and graduate school. For folks who are in their PhD program already, but are interested in learning about the board, we have a dissertation fellow internship program that usually is for summer when you're going into your 5th or 6th year, which I encourage folks to try if they're interested in looking at the board. And then we also have folks who, maybe they didn't want to go get a PhD, but they're still working a lot on like data related issues. And that's an analyst track that we have as well. So actually a lot of folks who were RAs decided not to pursue a PhD, but still wanted to continue on at the board. A number of them can go to a career analyst track as well. So there's a lot of different opportunities. I think the last thing I'll say is that working in antitrust in DC, there's a ton of job opportunities overall. I mentioned 3 different agencies that I went through for that. There's private sector. There's many other agencies that have antitrust functions as well. The biggest other one being the Federal Trade Commission. So if you're interested in those issues, there's tons of those jobs. They are mostly in DC. Not totally, but many of them are in DC. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And so it sounds like the Fed is hiring at like multiple levels, many people coming fresh from the PhD and in different levels, and presumably all of those jobs will be posted in the Joe, and that's like the way to find them.
That's correct.
Great. So, and so far we don't have any questions in the chat. So please start asking your questions. I can come up with some questions, but it will be best. We want to make sure we're answering the questions that folks have. So Julie, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are?
Well, I have a little bit of a more interesting or different track that I got to my job. So I got my undergraduate degrees, got married, had 2 kids, was getting ready to go to graduate school, and my kids have disabilities. So I had to stay home with them instead of going to graduate school like I had originally planned. So it got pushed off a little bit, but I was able to hold down, being a stay-at-home mom and attending graduate school after my youngest was about 3 years old. So, and it took me about the standard amount of time to get a PhD. I got my PhD in public policy and political economy. I really liked it because it was something that had broad applications, and I could kind of focus in on like a particular policy that I was interested in and make that, and look at it from a very analytical perspective. So, but after I finished my PhD, I had decided that I didn't want to go into academia, that I liked teaching, that I liked interacting with people, but it's not the only thing that I wanted to do with my time, because it felt kind of like, academic life is very demanding, and it is a 24-hour job almost. And I liked the idea of going into, an 8 to 4 job. And when I clock out, that's it. I don't have to continue answering emails and do other things. So, and because my kids have disabilities, we're kind of stuck in the Dallas area. So I had to find something that was either a nonprofit or government related when I started looking for a job. And so I looked at GAO, I looked at the Federal Reserve, here in Dallas, and I looked at BLS. And when I interviewed at BLS, I was really impressed by the people there and the culture. And I took a position in economic analysis and information. Just about all people who start at BLS start at what's called the GS7 level, or the General Schedule 7, even if you have an advanced degree sometimes, depending on how the certification process works. So, but I accepted a position through a program called Pathways for Graduates. And that is a one-year program that's basically like a fully paid internship. And after that, they decide, okay, well, did it work out? And they'll hire you on as permanent. Well, I started my Pathways for Graduates in 2016 when the Trump administration came in and instituted a hiring freeze. So after a year, I had to go and find a new job pretty quickly. So I went and I taught macro at a local community college for about a year and a half. And they were finally able to reopen my position, and I rejoined BLS, and I have been there since. In 2021, the supervisor for my division passed away, and I took her place. And I've been in the supervisory role since. I manage 3 other people in my division, and we produce over 200 news releases. We attended 16 conference events last year. So we go and we set up a booth and we talk to people. A lot of the work that we do is involved in trying to convince people to give us their information voluntarily. As you know, and anybody who works in data collection right now will tell you response rates have been going down across the board. And a lot of the statistical agencies have been really trying to focus on that. So I have a very important job to make sure that BLS stays out in the media and in the news and is responsive to not just the people who call in, but the people that we collect data from. So a lot of times we'll do things to assist them with that. Some other career tracks that we have at BLS, like I mentioned, pretty much everybody starts off at the introductory level, a GS7. And you'll take, at least in the regional offices, the most common position is field economist. And that's in doing directly collected data. And it's not just going out and, collecting the data. There is a lot of like boots on the ground, very technical work that goes into doing the collection, as well as making sure that you're doing the sample collection correctly, whether it's verified. It takes usually about 2 years to be fully trained in one of the field economist positions. And BLS invests a lot of time in training, and just about all of our management have come from our field economist positions, at least out in the regional offices. The national office has a little bit different structure. They're the program offices. So they are the ones who determine all of the different surveys, the work on the surveys. So they take all the data that we collect in our regions and they clean it up and spit it back out, and we publish that information. They do a lot more than that. But, and if you, trying to think of any other big career tracks that we have, that's, I think that's pretty much it.
Thanks. Jess.
Great, awesome. So my career path, I got my PhD in economics at American University, so here in DC. My job market paper was actually on bankruptcy and the application, I think, of spatial and GIS methods to economic analysis. There were several of us working with our professor who got a major NSF grant to collect data from old bankruptcy court dockets. So several of us got, really unique data, new data. So several of us got our dissertations out of that, which is really neat. After that, I did a visiting position in academia for 3 years, actually while I was completing my dissertation, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed research, the whole thing. But it was a visiting position, and I also had location constraints because my husband's also an economist. So we had the two-body problem, which I know happens in our field sometimes. So after my visiting position, after his postdoc, we focused our job search primarily on the non-academic market. And that actually ended up being a really good fit for both of us. But for me personally, I enjoy working closely with government and with policy. So being in DC was like the right place. I ended up at MITRE and he ended up at RAND. So this was back in 2018. So I started at MITRE in 2018. And in the beginning, you're sort of like, the technical contributor. You are a practicing economist, working on research, contributing to different projects. So I come from just broadly applied micro. And that meant I was put on projects for the FAA, for Treasury, Department of Transportation, IRS, anywhere where they're looking for someone with applied micro. We also have microeconomists, and those are sort of different projects they work on. So after a few years as a technical contributor, I started leading projects, which was, it's a different job. Every time you take on a new role, it's like different skill sets that you're exercising. And there's skill sets that you don't necessarily learn in grad school. So you sort of pick up on the job and you try to get mentorship from the folks who've been doing it for a while. So as a project leader, I mentioned we do a lot of interdisciplinary work. So I work a lot with data scientists, with statisticians, biostatisticians, and that was really interesting because the methods across the different disciplines are a little different, and we use different language, different, ways of describing the same thing. There are different preferences for, like, for example, fixed effects versus random effects. And I also got exposed to things that I did a little bit of in grad school, but really there are other people who are really good at it. For example, building data and modeling pipelines. Data scientists specialize in that. There are a lot of best practices for how to document code, for how to build things that are replicable, for considering computational limitations. So that was something I learned a lot from just being in that interdisciplinary environment. So yeah, I did the project lead thing. I'm still doing that. And then started a group lead role fairly recently. And that's also a whole other skill set, I think. It's about the people side of things, about management. And it's very different from like being a technical contributor, coding, writing papers all day, to now you are a manager. How do you help nurture other people's career? How do you put yourself in their shoes, especially when you have people who are, straight out of college, who are PhD economists, who are maybe more seniors. So it's like the full gamut of different levels of experience. So trying to put yourself in their shoes. How do you give feedback, both positive and constructive feedback? How do you resolve conflict? So I often say, like, these are all things that I have to do now in my job that I didn't learn in grad school. So I think approaching it with a certain level of humility is important. Then, I think Gloria and Julie both mentioned hiring. MITRE hires economists. We both hire PhD economists as well as analysts, so like bachelor's and master's level folks. Most of the work, almost all the work I would say is applied. So both micro and macro. So people with job market papers and with some sort of applied paper would be the best fit. There's less of a focus on like pure theory or pure econometrics. That's just not really what we do here. And then primarily our projects are with government agencies. So we have some of the same citizenship requirements as with the federal requisitions. So yep, I think that's it from my end.
Thank you. And Scott, you mentioned a little bit, if you want to tell us a little bit more about how you got to this job, why you decided to make this transition, and then also maybe a little bit about what the career path might look like for someone who is starting out as like a fresh PhD.
Sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I went straight through from my PhD onto an academic position, then to my government position. But one thing I wanted to underscore is that my PhD, my dissertation, and the topics that I was working on are very different than the topics I work on today. And I think this is very common for non-academic economists, that they sort of may jump to other topics. At least with my anecdotal experience, this is quite common. So there's, a couple different pathways you can go down within research. Is that, you can get interested in something in your PhD, write a dissertation on that topic, and then just really hammer that one topic as hard as possible throughout your career. And many successful people, in fact, the most successful people often go that path because you get very specialized. And then there are some others that may branch out. In my case, I was doing applied micro and law and economics and sort of empirical causal inference kind of stuff early in my career. And I just sort of followed the research topics where the data was. And so I had some colleagues who had good data on real estate and housing. And so I got interested into some topics where I saw that there was good data and jumped on to some of those areas in housing and real estate. And then when I got to the BEA, I continued sort of on that path a bit, but then I was doing some work on housing and real estate, and then there was a project on valuing land, and sort of that's kind of close to real estate in terms of some methodological similarities. But then I got going on to some environmental economics topics, since land is an environmental asset as well, and so it's sort of you get these little twists on your research, and it can take you much farther from where you began. And so that's sort of characterizes my kind of path, is that I've been able to move on to some different areas that I've just found interesting. And that's one of the advantages of, I think, working for a non-academic position as well, is that you're not on a tenure clock necessarily, that you can write a paper that it takes a while to do. I think we've already Gloria and others have already talked about how in many jobs you have a certain amount of time that's devoted to your research, and so these are long-term projects often, that they may take a year, they may take several years to publish, going from starting from your data or whatever to ultimately publishing it. And so that is a lot more stressful when you're on a tenure clock in an academic job, or if you're working for some sort of research lab or something where it's dependent on grant funding, would you also have a pressure cooker on the time of publication for your research and so forth. And government research jobs are a little bit more forgiving on some of those timelines and the nature of the longer term projects. And so that's what I would kind of underscore from my background, is that if you look at my CV, it sort of wanders through some different topics. I think the broad theme is applied micro, empirical applied micro, and causal inference in many cases, but not always. And part of that is sort of the nature of my jobs have been having to wear multiple hats. And there are a lot of government jobs that if you're interested in that sort of thing, that those are available, as well as there are other government jobs that have been mentioned that are very specialized. If you're just interested in a narrow set of things, you can find those as well. I think some of those were already discussed here, but I just wanted to throw that out there. In my agency, sort of as far as career paths, there are many different career paths to the BEA or statistical agency. We hire a lot out directly from grad school or even undergrad for our analysts and production staff. But we also hire people that are sort of mid-career, that have been from coming in from other places, whether it's academia or other statistical agency or somewhere else in the government. And we've hired people from the Fed, for example, and in my group. And so there are a lot of paths to get here. One thing I'll sort of highlight for those of you who are either new PhDs or interested or in a PhD program or aspiring to go into a PhD program, is that a path that seems to be also quite common is after grad school, we do see a lot of people going to do some sort of postdoc or some 1, 2, 3 year position that has gets you more experience, gets you more the pathways was mentioned. We've had a number of pathways fellows in my group, as well as some CSWEP fellows in my group that have gone on, have used that to sort of jump into another federal position. And those are sort of great opportunities for people that I think one of the best things about some of those positions is that you do get a flavor of what you're getting into before you do a full jumping into it, which is, I think, very helpful, and you get a sense of where you want to go from that. And same with being an RA in some sort of research group that some I know now in talking with, I also teach a class at GW on sort of an evening class. And I have had students that are interested in doing essentially a pre-doc, which, is very common now, where people spend a year or 2 or 3 even before their PhD begins, to sort of get a sense of research at various institutions. I know that Fed and various centers at universities have those opportunities available as well. And in both of those cases, getting some flavor of what you like and what you dislike is about government jobs and also related academic jobs is really important, because for many people, like, the question of how much do I want research to be part of my job is a really big question. There are government jobs where, I think Gloria was mentioning in her positions, where some jobs have a very small research component and some have a much larger research component. And for some people, they're just like, they have, once they have gotten a taste of either direction, either position, their preferences start to sort of go towards one or the other. And having some exposure to both is, I think, something that I've seen a lot of other sort of government economists. Their first position may not be their like their last position. They may start in one way and then go another direction. I think that's very common, not just from those of us that have spoken so far, but I think many government economists I've talked to have that experience. And so yeah, I think I've talked quite a bit, so I'll put down the microphone. I did actually I did see one question in the comments. I don't know if we're going to jump into questions just yet, but
yeah, we'll go to questions now, and I'm going to start by sort of combining a few, and then after that I'm going to see if Danny and Masa can chime in, combine them. So I think there have been some questions about, like, the process of applying to these jobs, and also any special skills that you should develop or emphasize if, different from if you were looking for an academic job. So, and then also there's questions about whether you have to be a citizen to have these jobs. So not everybody has to answer every question, but if folks could speak to, do you need to be a citizen to have a job in your organization? How does the process for applying to a job differ from, the academic process is pretty well understood. It's the jobs will be posted in Joe at a certain time. You'll have interviews, you'll present your job market paper. Weird stuff will happen that you don't know about, and you will or won't hear back from people. And also, are there, any particular skills that folks should be thinking about developing and or emphasizing in the application? So does anybody, let me just throw it open to the whole panel. Does anybody want to speak to any pieces of those?
Well, I can chime in. I've had to go through the hiring process pretty intensively in the past couple of years. I had to replace my entire team, so I had to do a bunch of hiring. So I have a lot of advice for people on how to approach the federal application. So you go to usajobs.gov, and you're going to set up your profile there, and you're going to set up a CV, or your resume. What you want to do is you want to put everything in there. It does not matter how long it is. If it takes up 5 pages, that's okay. Because what they do when they're matching up the resumes with there's also a interview section that you'll fill out. And what HR does is they kind of match up. Okay, so did the skill that they mentioned here, is it backed up in the resume? So usually in the federal application process, you'll have to do that. You'll have to submit your resume as well as supporting documentation. And then, like I said, you'll fill out a questionnaire that'll be a bunch of drop-down menus, and it will be like, okay, how many years have you had, experience in this skill? Whatever you put in there, just make sure that it matches up with your resume. And putting in more detail is a good thing, especially, and you can go back and you can edit these things as well. You can go through the questionnaire and see, oh, well, I didn't quite go into enough detail with this one. You can go back and do it. The other thing you need to know about federal jobs is that they very often have a very short lifespan. So most of the job positions that are posted for BLS go up for 7 days. Sometimes I've seen 10 days. It is very short. And when you see, but if you have your search set up, it'll pull up those job announcements and it'll send you an email. So just make sure that you've got some really detailed search settings and some alerts set up for USA Jobs account, and you'll be in much better position than like 90% of the candidates.
Thanks. And Danny has dropped in the chat a link to some guidance from SGE on how to apply for government jobs. And do you need to be a citizen to work at the BLS?
Yes, you do.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in because the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Board is a little bit different, I think, from a lot of other government agencies. So the Federal Reserve Board does not go through USA Jobs, at least last I experienced this. And so we try to follow a little bit more the procedures for the new PhD market that you would see from a lot of academic institutions. So you will see information on Joe, and you will go through kind of the AEA process and the flyout process, similar to how you would do that. And this is because the way the mysterious way that the federal government is structured, the Federal Reserve as a independent monetary authority and banking agency has kind of a separate setup. So there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to align it with what people would be expecting from the traditional academic market. So in that sense, I think what you'll see is not all that different. And there are some other agencies that are in a similar boat. So if you're interested widely in different types of federal opportunities, I totally agree with Julie that you should familiarize yourself with USA Jobs, but then also check to see, like, if you're not seeing anything from a particular agency, that you would expect to be hiring, you should check the Joe and that agency's website specifically to see if they're for some reason outside that system. So DOJ, when I did that, they were on USA Jobs. FCC was on USA Jobs. So like it depends. So I would keep that in mind. In terms of the question about US citizenship, at the board, we do not require that you are already a US citizen when you apply and take a job. However, you have to agree to go on to the path to citizenship. So you have to be authorized to work in the United States and then do things like apply for a green card, permanent residency, and then eventually become a US citizen. Obviously that takes time. So you're not, it takes a number of years. So you're not required to be a citizen immediately. When I was at DOJ, I was required to be a US citizen upfront.
Thanks. Jess or Scott, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I can say that, yeah, at BEA, we do have the citizen requirement. Unfortunately, I say that just in the sense that being on the hiring side, we do get applications from excellent candidates who don't have citizenship that we're like, like we wish we could interview them and so forth, and well, we can't. And but there are many opportunities even within government or quasi-government Gloria mentioned that the Federal Reserve is both at the board, but I believe the Federal Reserve regional banks don't have the requirement as well. At least I've met a number of economists who are not citizens at the regional banks that work on research roles and various other supervision and regulation kind of roles and groups as well as other big organizations like the IMF and World Bank hire many economists that are not US citizens. And so there are many sort of adjacent type institutions that hire non-citizens in economics.
Yeah, and I'll add to this. So I don't think MITRE has like draconian rules around citizenship, like maybe for the federal agencies, but if you are going to work on a project for the agency, you need to get some kind of like clearance or fitness or suitability. So I think, that's sort of where that comes in. And then in terms of our hiring procedures, so we don't post on USA Jobs. We try to follow the Joe cycle. So you'll see some of our PhD level requisitions out on Joe. But we do also hire out of cycle, and whatever post on Joe, that will also show up on our MITRE like external career site. We also post on LinkedIn, and then the non-PhD roles will be on like our website, won't be on Joe.
Scott, did you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on one of the thoughts from Julie on your USA Jobs application and resume, that one thing that we have experienced in the hiring process, and I think this is what Julie was mentioning about trying to be as detailed and specific as possible, is that sometimes people sort of underrepresent their background on the resume, especially new PhDs, because a lot of the questions are worded, that it's worded based on, it sounds like your experience on projects, as in like, from prior work experience. But there is a lot of experience from even your PhD program and independently working with your dissertation or your master's thesis was a project that required independent sort of independent execution and all of or in some case working with teams and all sorts of these kind of stock questions about your work experience. A lot of new PhDs underrepresent what their experience is, even within their grad school or even their prior jobs, if they, to their experience before that. And so, so I will say that don't be overly conservative in your USA Jobs resume. It's not, I know that when you're applying to the private sector, you want to be sort of neat and efficient with your resume and CV, have things fit on a page or two, and and then just let that speak for itself and your experience. And hopefully your interview, you can fill in some more of those details. With federal jobs, it's almost the reverse. You want to be as verbose as possible in a lot of your in your resume on USA Jobs, and again tying it back directly to experience, as Julie was saying, just so that some of those initial scans of your resume are not the people who are going to be interviewing you for hiring. And so they're just trying to connect some of those dots to make sure that you've cleared various minimum bars in order to get you that interview process. We've had very qualified candidates not make those initial bars because of this process of trying to match resumes to their experience. And so somehow we've gotten PhDs that haven't made it through the interview process, just not because they weren't qualified, just because they underrepresented their experience to that point. So I can't emphasize that enough when applying to government jobs, that you need to be as complete and comprehensive as possible.
I agree. I mean, be detailed and toot your own horn. Don't be modest.
I'm just going to add quickly two things. So one, and anybody who wants to add a nuance or disagree with this is respect to their organization can pipe up. But in terms of like the job talk and the process, I think often it's the job talk in a non-academic setting will be very much the same as in an academic setting, where you should already be thinking about reaching a broader audience, because like even within an economics department, people in other fields like won't know why your question is important and stuff like that. So you should be like making sure your talk is doing that for an academic setting. And in most cases, like it'll be a similar, or in many cases it'll be similar, but you should definitely feel free to ask the person, and you should ask the person who's running the search, like, how should I be, like, how long will the talk be? Should I leave time for questions at the end? Like how should this differ? And if so, how from like a job I would give, that I practice to give in an academic setting. So that's just one thing about the process. And then I also wanted to mention a class of jobs that isn't represented on the panel, but just to think about, in addition to the IMF, World Bank, and those types of organizations, you have places like Brookings and Urban, Brookings where I am, and think tanks, everything from think tanks to policy advocacy organizations, and that sort of would hire economists. And those job application processes tend to be a little bit less, are not always maybe timed with the normal sort of Joe market, but also might not, because they might be more driven by funding that those organizations get for certain types of projects, and so then they're hiring associated with that. But you can keep your eyes open for those jobs, and then also kind of program evaluation type, so you have like APT, RAND. Well, RAND does lots of different things. Mathematica, MDRC, so there's a whole set of types of organizations that hire economists to do, sort of applied work in economics, that I think also many of those organizations probably would be able to hire non-citizens, and for many jobs would be willing to sponsor, to do the sponsorship. So I just wanted to throw those out. And then I think I'll see, Danny, do you have a collection of questions we should put to the panel now?
Sorry, my audio's there we are. Yes, so I think the two that were asked, and I can just kind of throw them both out to the panel, as one is that many of you are in leadership roles, so there's a question of whether or not there was leadership training as you built to those roles, and the other question was about work-life balance and sort of typical hours. So I think both of those were expressed by several of our audience.
Yeah, and I think again we could just throw it out to whoever wants to respond to whichever part of that question.
I can kick us off. So in terms of training for management and leadership, there was not that in the situation that I came through. As I mentioned earlier, I applied to this management position, jumping from DOJ to the Federal Reserve Board. So, like I was starting at the board in that situation. I will say though that I was looking also at staying at DOJ and what their management track was. And there was, I would say, not very much specific training or emphasis on that. That being said, I think that the way I kind of prepared myself for that and made some decisions on like, oh, this is something I want to do more of, was I talked to my managers at DOJ at the time and asked for some more like project management and like small team leadership type responsibility. So I did have to take some initiative, but the managers were very receptive to doing that with me. So when I was working on some of these cases where we would get broken into teams with certain tasks, I asked if I could help organize some of that, because it was honestly more than a lot more going on that I think our typical management structure wanted to handle on their own, and the folks were very happy to let me do that, and I learned a lot from that, and that's, I think, was a significant preparation for me making the jump to a formal management position at the board. I think at the board, the board is has a lot more like mid-level management positions. So there are like ways that you can like start at like a certain rung on the ladder and move through it compared to some of the other federal agencies that I've seen. So in that sense, there's kind of a way to kind of prepare and be like, oh, and then, you know, do I really want to like go forward into like the bigger leadership roles that we call our officers? If you have some like ability to kind of dip your toe in the water first. So there is that. But one interesting thing about, I think, a lot of careers where we have to have like specialized scholarly training is that I don't think that there's necessarily a ton of emphasis on other types of life skills training in all PhD programs. I think this is one of those gaps sometimes, is that, you know, the way we do research, especially more and more and more, is co-authoring papers. I don't know that there's as much emphasis on figuring out how to work in teams and you know, manage as a group as maybe there could be in a lot of PhD programs. I think that's true actually of a lot of specialized fields, for folks who have to get like a higher graduate degree for that. They focus a lot on the specifics of the research or the skills, and maybe, you know, for producing that research, but not necessarily for like how to organize yourself and manage and that type of stuff. So I think it's something that's changing over time, but yeah, I think that's still broadly true. So I'll stop there.
Nor do they teach you how to teach. So it's a fairly, even for an academic position, the training that you get in the PhD doesn't cover the full spectrum of the job. Yeah, does anyone else want to comment on how they, Jess, it seems like you took on you have a lot of sort of management team leading roles now.
Yeah, I would say that the most I've learned about management and like people leadership were from non-economists, or from people who came up through their career managing sponsor relationships, managing people like truly the management track. You know, maybe they have like technical expertise in something, but I think there's probably some selection bias in like generally as a discipline, people who go into economics are interested in economics, right? And so we kind of come into these other roles sometimes by accident, I feel like. So there's that. I also wanted to address the other question about work-life balance. So this is something that probably differs by institution, and probably even within institution, if it's very large, like what group you sit in. So I can only speak to like my data point of one here. So I find that most economists, when we come in, you know, we choose this field because we're generally curious, we're driven, we work hard, our advisors push us really hard. And so sometimes it's easy to take that energy into your postgraduate career. And for a while there, I definitely was taking on like everything that I could possibly do, because I was like, you know, I'm new, I wanted to add value, I want to do interesting things. And at some point, I think it became like a personal choice to kind of like take on too much. And so at some point you realize, okay, you know, what do I care about in life? I also have a family, I also have hobbies, I have friends. And so you can, you know, I just sat down with my managers and said, hey, I've got, you know, these 3 projects I'm working on. I'm afraid that things are going to slip through the cracks. And you work on developing a professional script around working with your manager and figuring out, can things be delegated? Can, you know, this be pushed back? So there's, I think, just like standard work, like professional skill sets around like managing your workload and communicate. How do you communicate that to your manager? That I think is really important. And that's part of like the skill set that Gloria mentioned. Like we're not really trained in that, but it's actually really useful to have in the workplace.
I'm going to second what Jess said. I think that a lot of times, you know, work-life balance it's a real it's a real transition from the PhD program to being in the federal workforce, and it's a little bit of a culture shock. And you're going to have to make yourself focus on, okay, I don't need to do what I just did with my PhD, which is, it's a huge project, and you spend all of your time working on it. Your work life is not going to be like that. It's going to be, you're going to be working on various projects, and it's not just going to be one thing. You're going to have to, and especially if you're in a management position, you have to manage email, you have to manage your employees and their development, as well as what's planning for the future. When I started at BLS, there really wasn't much in the terms of it. I kind of got thrown into my position because of my boss passing away. And I really, up to that point, I hadn't really gotten a lot of development or leadership development that went into that. I mean, the Department of Labor is actually really good about this, and they had a lot of resources, but they didn't really have a whole specific development programs. But while I've been at BLS, and after I took my supervisory position and I gave feedback about that, they actually changed the culture. And we actually have a succession development program that we've just implemented in our office. Actually, it's in all the regional offices, where we have leadership and succession integrated from after you've finished training. You move into doing activities that are involved with, okay, so how does your boss do this kind of job? And what do they do in this position? So that's just speaking at BLS in my experience. In terms of like general work-life balance, it definitely does vary by agency. I've heard from different departments, even departments and agencies, so the agencies are within the departments, that there's a lot of variation. But one of the things I really like about the Department of Labor is that they try to model themselves, they try to be the model work employer. And so that means we have, I mean, like all of the options that you have available, all of the time off, you know, they are really strict about those rules. And federal benefits are notorious for being very generous. Make sure that you're familiar with it before you go into it. I mean, and realize, okay, just how much of that pay that you're giving up to get some of these other things. So, I mean, it was something that I had to struggle with myself when I was looking for a job. Do I want to make that trade-off for, okay, well, I'm probably going to take a little less pay for my job, but I'm going to get a lot more vacation time, and I have a lot more freedom in what I can decide that I'm going to be doing with my time. So, and I ultimately decided that I did want the federal position, and that I was okay with that trade-off, because, you know, I do have a family, and I do want to spend time with them, and I didn't want to be working all day, every day, 10 hours. When I became a manager, the work-life balance gets a little challenging, because what you're doing when you're a manager is you work to task, not to time. And so if you've got a project that needs to be finished and your staff have all logged off, but it needs to be done the next day, well, I guess I get to finish that up. Or I'm responsible if it's not finished. So sometimes, but I would say that overall my work-life balance is still very good. So sometimes I have to work over, but you know, I'll get credit hours and then I'll make it up on another day. So it usually balances out.
I can speak. I'll just emphasize what, you know, has already been said. And I think that work-life balance is better within federal government jobs, just because you do have some expectations about working the 40 hours a week generally. But as, you know, Julie underscored, there's going to be times, just like with any job, where you're going to be working more than that, you know, especially during crunch time. And that will oftentimes depend on the nature of your agency. So some, I think, with the Fed and with the BEA, or to some extent BLS and Census, that we have either in the Fed's case, you have FOMC meetings and so forth that are coming up on some hard deadline that agency, or, you know, for the whole, Fed, you have various deadlines that need to be met to revolve around that, as well as the production cycles of the agencies that produce statistics. You're going to have those deadlines, which sort of Julie was referring to. Some people may be signing off, but at some point, like, you have to make those deadlines, and sometimes the managers or other folks are going to have to be coming in and picking up the slack. But that is more exceptional, I think, than the rule in the federal government versus other places outside in the private sector and even academia, where the expectation is usually much higher than the normal 40-hour work week. So I think we do have some good advantage on work-life balance as well. And I did see a question, and forgive me, I'm jumping ahead, but I wanted to answer this as well in the chat about the difference between research in the federal government as well as in think tanks and in academia. That depending on your agency and depending on your group within the agency, there are going to be some agencies and some groups that have much more well-defined purpose for their research, where they expect research to be produced that is, very much down the middle on topic for your group or for your agency, and they don't really allow you to branch out as far. And there are some agencies and groups within agencies that really allow you to do a lot with your research time. And that does vary quite a bit across the federal government. And so if you are someone who has interest from your grad school experience, if you have broad interests, I would suggest to sort of look at the CVs of the people that you're going to be interviewing with and see what kinds of research that they're doing and they're publishing and kinds of projects they're taking on, because that's going to be your best indicator of kind of what kinds of projects get approved to be published and get worked on and so forth. And that's, I think that served me well to, get in a group that is very much accepting of the kind of the research that I do. But and I've seen people jump from one job to another because of those. They're in a more restrictive environment on research, either in terms of research time or in research topics, where they feel like they're hamstrung on certain research topics and they can't do that. And one sort of last thing is just that the federal government, you do have, I think, generally less freedom in research than you might in the academic world, because you do have sort of approvals up the chain where, again, this differs by agency to agency, but they may not want you to be publishing on a particular topic that will draw a lot of criticism from the media or be just a very hot, button topic that they just don't want to really draw a lot of attention to. And that's not the same case in academia. In fact, in academia, you're encouraged to get lots of media mentions and be provocative in various ways. And so you have a little bit more freedom. So that is one of the restrictions, I think, and probably for non-academic positions outside of government, you do have some similar kind of reputational concerns about what you're publishing on and so forth. So I wanted to make sure I got that in there, but thanks.
Thanks. I'll just quickly add to what Scott said. I think, before I was at Brookings, I was a professor of public policy for 17 years or so. And I think in terms of it's like, how are you going to get the time? Who has to approve the work? And how is it going to be paid for? And like those things have to, and so when I was an academic, I was like, I can work on anything that interests me, but then sometimes if I needed more than my own labor, like, you still need to get funding. And so you're constrained by that. And then at some point I started to feel like, well, I just don't have time because I just am like answering email all day. And like, in theory, this is part of my job, but in practice, it was hard to get time. So, and whereas at Brookings, I'm more like I do have to fund my work. And so I'm a little bit more constrained by that. But at Brookings, we do have something kind of akin to academic freedom, that you would have at a university, but that might be different at a different think tank. So I think like just kind of like thinking about those things, and then how is the research gonna in this context, like how does it get paid for, how do I have time, and who has to approve it. So I think we have just like a few more minutes. I don't know, did we hit, is there something we've missed in the chat, Danny?
I think we got most of the questions. There might have been, yeah. So
okay. So
but
maybe since we'll just
so
wrap up.
I guess yeah. So I'll wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, especially our panelists on coming in on the federal holiday. We really appreciate it. If you have more questions, you can probably reach out to the panelists, or you can use the SGE as a resource. So in the announcement, you can see my email, vice president at SGE. So feel free to reach out. We have a bunch of events that we do as SGE. So we have virtual seminars. We'll be at the AEA meetings. We have a conference we do every year. So if you become a government economist, please reconnect, and you're welcome if you're at the AEAs, want to connect and see it, come to our sessions. We'll be there, and we'd be glad to see you. So yeah, thank you the panelists, thank you for all the students that are on.
Thank you so much for having us.